So anyway, she suggested we write a book about her childhood. Well, I didn't jump at that. I just laughed and said, oh, no, I don't think so. So she said, think about it and pray about it. Well, that was in January of 2020. 4 months later, without me really agreeing to do this, we were writing. Janine penned some memories of the 1950s, and I contributed topics from my story. We deleted and added topics and expanded on the manuscript. So we spent many, many hours on the phone for the next 9 months, crafting and recrafting sentences and paragraphs. Now, we grew up in North Dakota, but I live in the state of Washington, and Janine lives in the state of Iowa. So we wrote along, and then Janine's husband said, you know, it might be a bit more interesting if you had an unemotional perspective. Why don't you have the windmill? So we have the windmill's perspective. Now, we had a growing manuscript, but it was not near any kind of a product that you could consider a book. However, doors opened and we secured a publicist who helped us organize the material we'd written. So the story expanded to become a history of an era and a community in the 1950s. It went far beyond our little story of the 50s. So 1 year after beginning, while the Windmill Watched a slice of rural America in the 1950s, it was published in April 2021. Now, the unique aspect of the book has been mentioned previously here. It is written in 4 voices, that of Jackie and Janine and the Pfeiffer sisters together, and of the windmill. The windmill stood in the center of our farmyard and saw life unfold in the family, in our farming community, and in rural America. So we include clippings, photos, and even recipes from that era. The 1950s was an exciting time for folks living in rural America. Janine and I grew up on the plains of North Dakota. Yet readers living in all the Midwest will be able to identify with their story. But this story is not just for those who might be able to relate to the book's contents. It's also for those who are unfamiliar with the life on the Great Plains in the 50s. One of my city friends was totally amazed by what he read. He had no idea of what rural life entailed. For him, reading Windmill was an informative and a joyful experience. Janine, tell us more about the contents of this book.
Absolutely. What a pleasure. And what was it like to live on a farm in the Great Plains of North Dakota in the 1950s? For us, for Jackie and me, the children of Jack and Eudora Pfeiffer of Minoka, North Dakota, which is 10 miles east of Bismarck, right just north of Interstate 94 was our farm. Life on that farm was a wonderful unfolding of development of human nature. And we were taught morals and values of our parents, and actually our family, like most families of the Great Plains, had these strong rural roots and strong legacy from their past, from their grandparents, their great-grandparents, and beyond that, many of whom immigrated to this country. And so our lives were built upon those principles of hard work, loving family, loving each other, a love of God, an understanding and a love of education and a reading, and because of our work on the farm, a love of the soil and of love of stewarding the land, not just in farming, but in stewarding the land. And we note in While the Windmill Watched how our mom and our dad worked as a team in stewarding the land. For instance, and it's hard for me to imagine this because I only knew of our farmstead to be surrounded by miles and rows of trees in windbreaks. But in compiling the information for our book, I thought, my goodness, it wasn't always like that. It was the bare windswept Prairie that was there when Mom and Dad bought our farm in 1943. Was it, Jackie? 43.
It was
46.
actually 46. It was,
Yep.
they moved on in September 28th, 1946, $40 in the bank and a baby on the way, my mom said.
Yes, and that was Jackie.
That's me.
Yes, but they moved on to this farm, this section of land that was mostly farm ground, but then they also had a generous amount of pasture for cattle and sheep. That was the primary livestock sources that we had at that time when they came on, along with a few hogs. And then, of course, who didn't have chickens on their farm? But to think of this prairie that didn't have any trees on it and that were planted all by hand. And in the book, Jackie notes how she well remembers being out in the field late on summer evenings when the mosquitoes were just buzzing around her as Mom and Dad were watering these little saplings of trees. And we note in the book that they had planted about 4 miles of trees by hand in order to have soil conservation, wind conservation. You know, they tried to save that soil and protect it by growing trees, and to protect that our farmstead from the wind of that blows forever coming out of Canada. And of course, that's where the windmill comes into play. And the windmill that stood in the center of our barnyard was very, very tall. That particular windmill drew water for our livestock only, and we had a separate water source then for our house, which ended up being our second house, because the first one that came when Mom and Dad moved on the farm was really a shack that allowed the wind to come through the walls and the snow to come through also. And Jackie explains very well in our book about living in that house and what it was like, but also the love that was in that house at that time too. And I only know of that house as from pictures, because I was just a baby when Mom and Dad decided to build a new home. And for that, they paid cash. And of course, you remember back in the 50s, there was no such thing as credit, and definitely not credit cards. We paid with cash. And Mom and Dad, the story of the book tells so much about the values that Mom and Dad had on cash, and you work and earn the money first, and then you make the purchase. And that's just exactly what they did. But I do want to go back and point out again about the windmill being on our farm. And of course, our farm was 10 miles from Bismarck. The Bismarck capital, the skyscraper of the Prairie, was there, and of course tall enough so that if you dared climb to the top of the windmill, you could see the top of the Capitol. This is where Jackie's and my personalities change. We are very similar in many values and many characteristics, but when it comes to exploring the unknown, I give the edge to Jackie versus myself. She loved to climb that windmill. And there was a time, we talk about it in the book, how in 1954, how well I remember that, even though I was only 4 years old, she climbed to the top of the windmill and she says, "Janine, come on up here. I can see the Capitol from here." I started to cautiously climb 3 rungs up that ladder. And I looked up at her and I said, "I am not coming up here." And I went back down, put my feet on the ground, and that's where I've stayed ever since. And I've been very happy that way. So that the windmill becomes an instrument in the book that really shows the differences in our character, and yet also observed the similarities in our character. It observed life on our farm, the development of our family, and the unity that we had together. We were only about 2 miles from the small town of Menoken, which is just 10 miles east of Bismarck. And so consequently, the windmill was tall enough, it could see what was going on in our farming community and surrounding area, and really all that was happening. If you can envision that the windmill had eyes that could see beyond the horizons to all of the prairie, of the Great Plains, and even rural America. So that's the story that we talk about. We talk about our life on the farm. We talk about farm animals. We talk about machinery and how Jackie and I helped on the farm. We talk about our school, our country school, our wonderful country school at Menoken. It was grades 1 through 8. We had marvelous teachers there, particularly our lower grades teacher, who was Mrs. Violet Arntz. We had her in grades 1 through 4. She was a magnificent teacher. She was a grandmother, silver gray hair, perfectly coiffed, beautifully dressed, wearing high heels with jewelry, big earrings. She was an artist. She had such a love of education and teaching. And not only did she give us the basics in reading, writing, and arithmetic and beyond, but because of her love of the arts, we had so many wonderful experiences in presenting Christmas operettas, in singing, in dancing, in art, in learning about the great masters of art. She just provided a wonderful basic education for us. And we also, Jackie and I also give credit to Mrs. Arntz for laying the platform for such a strong education in grammar and punctuation. And believe me, when we wrote the manuscript for our book, While the Windmill Watched, that came in so handily. So not only were Jackie and I very observant proofreaders of the book, but we even had our publicist as a proofreader. We hired a proofreader, and away we went. A book was published. So we talk about our farming community and the closeness of our Menoken farming community in that era. And that was so true in the 1950s. People worked together. We played together. We went to church together. We were a cohesive unit. And it's so interesting that I might point out that because of the response to the book, baby boomers love the book and they love to share their stories about the 50s. So Jackie and I decided to start a YouTube channel, and you might want to jot this down. It's called the 1950s Fun Chat. And each week on our YouTube channel, we interview a guest who lived during the 1950s, and they share memories of their story about living in the 1950s. Now, we've interviewed folks who were born in 1950, who were born ahead of that, who were born anytime throughout that decade. And interestingly, we even interviewed a wonderful 95-year young lady this last Fun Chat that we had, who shared her beautiful story too. So the gamut of interesting lives that took place and lived and were wonderful residents and contributors of life in America are shared on this YouTube channel, the 1950s Fun Chat. So I encourage you to go there and subscribe and like our programs and all that good stuff. But anyway, that's part of what we've done because of the book, and the uniqueness of the story that we tell, the bond that we have as a family and a community is just outshines the words that are on the pages. And one thing that I noted to Jackie after we had put the final dot over the I and crossed the final T was that I always knew that we had wonderful parents. But golly, folks, it was just remarkable to go back into time and into history, and as an adult, review the life that our parents gave us on the prairie in North Dakota in the 50s. And we are just delighted when the readers can sense that in our book as well. You know, sometimes you'll read books about growing up in certain areas of the country, and perhaps even in the Plain States, from authors who can't wait to get away from the state. They just want to be away from North Dakota. And yet that was not Jackie's and my philosophy at all. We treasured that experience of growing up on the Great Plains in North Dakota in the 50s. And I do feel our mom and dad had so much to do with that. And of course, because we lived close to Bismarck, there wasn't extra money, but mom and dad somehow would find a way to pay for lessons, piano lessons, dance lessons for Jackie and me, and extra special opportunities that related to the arts that help expand who we were as farm kids on the prairie. And of course, it was always known, just always assumed that we would go to college. Nothing was ever said that you have to go to college, but we did. And both Jackie and I graduated from North Dakota State University and became professional women in our own right, and married, and then followed our husbands to where we ended up eventually living and raising our families. So we are certainly welcome to opening the question and answer period. We love to do this, and it's especially fun too to go into classrooms. So if any of you are any acquaintance with educators in your area who would like to learn more about history of the 50s and the Great Plains, we would love to Zoom with them. It's so much fun to go into classrooms and do this. Kids are just in awe of how we lived in the 50s compared to what they do now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Give me a plug a nickel in and I'll talk. Are there any questions?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Before we go to the video, does anyone in the room have any questions?
Did they have electricity?
Did you guys hear that?
Oh, yes. In 1949, rural electrification came by our farm. And one of the things we have in the book is the story of our neighbor who kept a meticulous diary and told about the electricity coming. Now, our farmhouse was, the new one wasn't built until 1951. So I grew up with no electricity, no running water, with the outhouse in the back. And when mom and dad moved into their little house, it was already occupied by mice, and they continued to stay there. I can remember my mom saying, "Jackie, stay away from the traps, stay away from the traps." But yes, we did have electricity in the new house. It must have been like a palace for mom, from the shack to this new house in the 1950s with a picture window.
Yes. Well, and also Dad had electricity in the barn too.
Mm-hmm.
When he was out milking at night, when he would come in from the field, or the wintertime, of course, it's very dark very early. He had the pleasure of having electricity rather than having lanterns out there when he was milking. It is interesting though, one of our fun chat guests was Judy Goring Miller, and she was our babysitter. She was our neighbor 2 miles away, and she talks about when they got electricity, but she said it wasn't dependable. She said that the weather could really mess up how they received their electricity, so they never let their kerosene lanterns, they never packed them away when they got electricity, because for a number of years, until electricity was stabilized coming to rural America, they depended on both sources of light. I do not remember anything like that though. Do you, Jackie?
Going to their house?
Oh, well, no, just not having electricity all the time.
No,
we needed it.
we did. No, it was very stable in our new house. New wiring, so. Who's next?
And we had running water. We in our new house in 1951, we had a septic system. I remember thinking, I was always, because our neighbors many of them didn't have running water and a septic system. And I remember thinking how fun it was to go to their house and use the outhouse, because that was something new to me. I didn't have that experience at home. Now, our grade school had electricity, running water, and a septic system. So all the time I was familiar with that luxury in rural America. But the town hall in Menoken, where we spent so much time with community activities, that did not have running water, a septic system. It did have electricity. So whenever there was an event there, because Dad was clerk of the Menoken Township and responsible for keeping the Menoken Town Hall in good working order, he would be the one to start the coal furnace a few hours before any event that occurred there. And then we were always the last dog hung, as Mom would say. And we would do the sweeping. You know, remember that sweeping compound? Oh, that smelly stuff that had oil in it, and you'd spread that on those hardwood floors and get the big wide push brooms and clean up all the dust that had accumulated on the floor. Well, we were the ones, our family was the one who would usually bring the water for washing dishes and drinking water, and then also be the ones to put out the furnace before we left.
Any other questions in the room?
Did they have telephone?
Oh, we didn't get a telephone until 1960. OR3 4560, that was the number. I don't know that I remember any. I know the number did change a number of years after that, but you know, I think most people remember their first phone numbers. And the OR stood for Orchard. I don't know. Orchard, yes. It came from Beck Telephone Company, which was formed by 3 counties, Burleigh, Emmons, and Kidder County. And so then rural telephone came to us. And of course we had a party line, but we were unique in that we only had 2 families on a party line. So we were kind of special that way compared to many of our neighbors who had multiple families on their party line. And I remember the reason that Mom and Dad agreed to getting a phone and the extra expense that it would cost is because Mom's family lived at Oaks, North Dakota, which was South Central, about a couple hours away from us. And Mom was always very concerned about her mother. My grandfather had been deceased years ahead of that, but she was always concerned about her. And by having a telephone, it would put her in easy communication with Grandma Louise. And then Dad's parents, Grandpa and Grandma Pfeiffer, lived in Bismarck. And they, again, it was a situation where to get a telephone would mean that they could be in communication with Grandpa and Grandma if anything went wrong, if they had to go to the doctor or the hospital. Mom and Dad were able to be more available rather than to make a trip to town or to send a postcard, as far as that goes back then. But we got television. Some people might want to know about television. We got our first television in 1956. How many of you remember Roy Rogers and Dale Evans or Kit Carson and his horse Champion? Well, I remember when we turned on the TV, there was Kit Carson riding across the prairie, dust coming out behind his horse. And that was a visual that probably will stay with me till the day I die. But television was, of course, black and white television was such a treat. And we did have rabbit ears on our TV. And of course, we put the aluminum foil on each rabbit ear to try and get better reception. But it was broadening life for rural Americans in the 1950s was broadening and expanding them in that area of communication. We weren't just a farm family that had a radio and depended on the radio for the markets, or Mom's communication with radio homemakers to help her be a more efficient homemaker. It was wonderful what happened with the forms of communication in the 1950s to help expand life and make it more prosperous for rural Americans.
If we don't have any more questions in the education room, we have
one more time. Anything else? Okay, then we're good.
All right. Dawn has her hand up. I would prefer to have the questions typed out in the chat, and I see, and Evelyn has one we'll get to in a minute, but we'll let Dawn, I unmuted her, so we'll let Dawn ask her question.
Hi,
well,
Dawn.
thank you. Hello. Thank you for an exciting presentation. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Thank you again. I have some quick, well, they're not so quick. I'll try to be fast. My one grandmother her family were Luxembourgian on both sides. Her father was born in America. Her mother was from Luxembourg. She came with some of her family to South Dakota, but they had North Dakota relatives as well. Grandmother Kate was a homesteader along with some of her brothers. And your description of your first home that it was windy and shack-like. Was it a homestead claim shack? And also my other question is, did you have any awareness or relations with Dakota or Lakota people who might have been near you or in Bismarck, or did you have any relationships in that regard? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Actually, it was not the original farmstead was closer to about a quarter of a mile south of that farmstead, and it's now covered by the interchange. No, the house was a typical 1900s or late 1800s, 2-story, 2 rooms on the 2 rooms. And then you went upstairs and there was sort of an attic. That's what it was. But it was, my mom told me that when I was little, my crib is next to the window and she had to put newspaper around. She lined the crib with newspaper so that the snow would stay off me that was coming through the walls. So I survived. Tough. And as far as the Lakota, we did not.
Okay. Thank you
Sorry.
very much. No, it's
You're welcome.
wonderful. Thank you so much for your comprehensive and emotional offerings, because you really do make people engage with your personalities and your story. Thank you.
You're welcome.
very welcome.
Our pleasure.
Our next question is from Evelyn, and she is interested to hear about where the recipes in your book come from.
Okay.
Go ahead, Janine. That's the
Yes.
thing.
Yes, most of the recipes were mom's recipes, and we do have that noted by each recipe whose they were. Some of the recipes were from our dear community friends. Mom was involved, and so many women in the Minokan community were involved in a homemakers group. And maybe some of you are familiar with homemakers clubs, and maybe some are still in homemakers clubs. In North Dakota, they have dwindled quite a bit, but the Minokan Homemakers Club was a very active club, and I call them the welcome wagon of the community. And those women were just one cohesive group in helping to better each other. And so many of those recipes, or some of those recipes that are in there, are from former Minokan Homemakers members. If I have a favorite recipe in that book, it would be Mom's chocolate fudge. Oh my goodness, that was so good. It was so creamy, but she only made it during the holidays. And but I always had a love for food. My dad did too, and I follow my dad's footsteps with that. Mom always said that she eats to live, and Dad lives to eat. Well, I follow my dad's footsteps, and so my profession now is in the food industry, and so consequently, those recipes are all treasured pieces of information. But I particularly did like that chocolate fudge of hers.
Well, thank you. Again, the next question we have online, and then we'll get to Alan, who has his hand raised. What kinds of fun reactions have you gotten from students about how different life was in the good old days?
Yes.
There was, this was not from a student, but the one that is brought to mind is this. I describe, and if any of you are raised in a farm, you know this is really typical. There was a lamb, a ewe who was having trouble lambing. And so Dad said, come here, Jackie, I need you to help. So anyway, I helped this lamb birth by putting my hand in the uterus and bringing the feet forward and the head so it wouldn't get all, twisted up. And I helped the birth of this lamb. And my friend said, Jackie, I can hardly believe you stuck your hand in that uterus. Like, well, why not? That's what one needs to do on the farm.
Yes. The farm was our outside classroom. That was our very conservative veterinary science classroom in our headquarters, and that was part of learning. What has been so helpful all through life.
back to this question, I guess we might refer to the fifth, sixth, and seventh graders. We Zoomed with at Minokan School. They their questions were most interesting and fun. Can you remember it specifically, Janine?
Well, the first one that comes to mind was one student asked, and I really didn't understand why he would have thought that way, but he said, were people mad back then?
Yeah, or mean.
Yeah,
or something.
mean.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. That's one that comes to mind too.
And I don't know that we ever made reference to anything like that in the book, or what might have given him the idea. We did have one of the students in that classroom happened to be related to Dad's good friend, Howard Goring, and our babysitter, Judy Goring Miller. And I think she thought it was very informative of how her family lived back then, and she didn't realize what the living situation was like then. Other questions that they might have had, they'd like to know specifically where we lived, where our farm was, and that was true when we Zoomed with the history class at the University of Mary in Bismarck too. They actually Zoomed in and Googled in after they got the address and could see the exact location of where we lived. And Jackie does still own our farm. We did sell off the farmstead, and we had to sell in Burleigh County. We had to sell 40 acres along with that. So that amount of ground with the buildings and our home were sold previously to Jackie having complete ownership of the farm ground.
So let's turn to Alan, who has patiently had his hand up.
Hi, Alan.
Hello.
Hi, thank you so much.
You're
And
welcome.
I really enjoy this because you could be describing my childhood. I grew up in southeastern South Dakota, and from the few references you've made in your talk, I can estimate I am a contemporary age-wise of you, grew up in those very early 1950s on the farm. And I guess my question for you, my experience was I grew up on the homestead farm that my great-grandfather had homesteaded. And grandparents were always a huge factor in my life. And through them, I became aware of my immigrant heritage. And I become a dedicated family history researcher. So I wonder if you might say a little bit more about your grandparents and that immigrant heritage that you alluded to at the beginning of your talk, and how that shaped your early outlook on the farm.
Our grandparents originally came from South Dakota. My grandmother, her name is Brost, her maiden name is Brost, and there are still some Brosts in South Dakota. Yeah.
Maybe we're related, Alan.
We are related. There's no doubt about it. I can prove it.
You can? Oh, you've been doing your homework, huh? Well, this is B-R-O-S-T, but I know that it's the same family if you add a Z as you've done. So,
well, if I could quickly interject, you know, what happens is my relatives, and I have many in North Dakota, spell it both ways. And when they spoke the dialect, they didn't speak High German, they spoke the dialect, and it always came out T. But my great-grandfather, before he proved his homestead claim, went to a notary public, and he said the correct orthography of my name is B-R-O-S-Z. But I claim many with a T who are relatives. So we'll have to talk sometime. Thank you.
Well, we did some, gosh, how many years ago was this? We did some cemetery.
it was I think it was 2004.
Okay.
We had something called the Girls Just Want to Have Fun trip. And so her daughters and my daughters and we rented a van. And it was the most boring, we did this several times, but my daughters tell me it was the most boring time because we stopped at all South Dakota cemeteries and took a picture of anything that said Bros on it.
Yes. But how did our grandparents affect our lives? I think just the fact of knowing that they were there. Grandpa Pfeiffer did help our dad, on the farm after he retired. And so Grandpa was a huge part of our daily lives, just his being there. And he had a wonderful personality and a very sweet character, honest, with lots of integrity. And my grandma was just so loving. She always had these loving arms out. We especially note that in the book when we talk about January 1st, because every January 1st, we would be invited into their house for New Year's dinner. And of course, whenever we'd come, as what Grandma would note it afterwards, that Grandpa would sit in his big chair near the picture window, and he'd holler and say, "Ma, they're here!" And so we'd park outside, and as we'd get out of our car and come up the steps, Grandma was at the front door and holding it open, and she'd say, "Frederikus Neues Jahr!" And so we always knew that Happy New Year. That was about the only German that I can really remember. She and Grandpa spoke German some, especially when they didn't want Jackie and me to know what they were talking about.
And Dad did that. Our dad did also. He didn't speak English until he went to school.
True.
So
Yes.
Sometimes is that the same with you, Mr. Brose?
Yes. And then
Absolutely, yes. My father spoke no English until he went to school, and I asked all of his siblings, "How did you learn English?" And invariably they said, the older ones, the teacher taught us in school. The younger ones said, well, the older ones brought some home, and I started to understand it. But yes, indeed. So they were Germans from Russia, were they?
Yes.
Yes, mine
They were.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And our Grandpa and Grandma Louise, who lived at Oaks, we didn't see them. We saw them maybe twice a year. Mom loved to go to back to Oaks on Memorial Day because she liked to decorate the graves, as was Decoration Day was known back then. And that was a time that we could get together with our cousins and play with them, and she could catch up with them then. And then the other time that we would go to Oaks would be during Thanksgiving, and we really document these holidays in our book and the uniqueness of them, because oftentimes, as you know, in North and South Dakota, Thanksgiving time is usually a blizzard, snow of some sorts, definitely cold. And so we describe in there these sometimes treacherous trips back home on these snowy, blizzardy roads. But it was a time when Dad, of course, being on the farm, he had to get up very, very early and do chores and fed the cattle extra and the livestock extra that morning, so that because we knew we'd get home late and it just wouldn't be time to feed them then. And really with that in mind, Dad knew his love for Mom was such that he knew she had to go back to see her family those 2 times a year. It was like a recharging for her, and then to come back to where we lived and farmed. Our Grandpa Louise died when I was 7 years old, so I didn't know him very well. He was always a very somber man, very hard worker. He had been in a farm accident, and that really contributed to his ill health and his eventual death. My Grandma Louise was this sweet, petite little lady, and I just so remember her humming as she worked around the house. She was just a joyful lady, and it was a pleasure to be around her. And some summers, Jackie and I would take the Jackrabbit Lines bus. We would take a Greyhound bus from Bismarck to Jamestown. Then we had an aunt and uncle who lived in Jamestown. They would make sure we got to the Jackrabbit Lines depot, and we'd take the bus to Oaks and spend a week with Grandma.
That's fun.
Such great stories. Anyone else have questions? You can type it into the chat or raise your hand, which is a thing on the controls, not an actual hand raising. Catherine has put into the chat how you can buy this wonderful book. And she's got a little URL you can click on to go straight there.
Yes.
Evelyn,
North Dakota State.
Yeah, go
sorry.
ahead, Jackie.
Go ahead.
Oh.
I was just going to say North Dakota State University is our main distributor of it, nationwide, worldwide. And there's a direct link on the website, on our website, to NDSU where you can purchase it.
If they choose not to purchase at the historical
Through the Heritage Store.
Foundation. Yep, they're
Yes.
able to.
Yes.
Exactly.
Here we go.
Yes, there we
Yeah.
go. It's beautiful,
Very
isn't it?
nice.
This is Catherine, who is very savvy. This kind of
Okay, we want you to note though that this is a beautiful actual picture of a North Dakota sunset. It wraps around the back also. The couple who took the pictures from Park River up north by Grand Forks, and we had a gal here, an artist, a photography artist, who created the book for us. She's from Colville, Washington.
It is a beautiful cover. And it reminds me that I wanted to ask a question about Jackie, you climbing up that windmill tower. How old were you when you first did it? And then how long did you continue?
I was probably pretty young because my mother always said I was part monkey. So, climbing here and there. I don't know. I just didn't, in my baby book, she wrote fearless. So I think I came out that way. Fearless.
And you never convinced Janine to go up it with you?
No.
Never.
No.
No.
So
And
I
Jackie's and her husband are world travelers still. They love exploring and learning about the world. And my husband, Fred, and I are very content to be Iowa farmers. We've had experiences outside of Iowa, definitely. But, we like keeping our feet planted here in Iowa.
Yeah. I met my husband teaching my first year teaching in Ashley, North Dakota. That's near the South Dakota border, near Aberdeen. And we went to Alaska to teach, and we were there for 21 years. Both of our daughters were born there. And then, then we wanted 4 seasons. So we ended up in the state of Washington. And here we are.
And are there windmills, Janine, on your farm now? The same kind of old windmill?
No, there is one that is not in working order, but and that happens to be out in a field. It was a former farmstead. Did we have a windmill? We didn't have a windmill there. No, we've never had a windmill on this location.
It really is such a great symbol of early 20th century through mid 20th century farms. Yeah, I mean,
and that was
iconic in the landscape.
It is.
And with all the pasture in the prairie, that was in some cases the only way to get water for the livestock when they were pastured.
And the wind does certainly blow.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah. One question. Go ahead, honey.
Mom used to say, Jackie has often reported that Mom used to say, "Oh, that incessant wind," and it just got to I think with some people, it was noted, especially in the earlier founding of the state and the homesteading days, that there weren't trees, and many of the immigrants came from areas that were abundant with trees, and then to come to this prairie where there was nothing but horizon and wind, oftentimes women would just walk off into the horizon because the whole persona of the environment affected their mental health so much, and they were not heard of after that. There's some amazing stories about that.
One question that I'm sometimes asked is that how did an outdoor, hands-on childhood shape my future? Well, any of you who've been lived in a farm will know that it really teaches self-reliance and creativity, and it's been beneficial wherever I've lived. And yet today, my mother will say in my head, "Think, Jackie, think." And that's all it takes for me to solve a problem, pretty much. It's just, that's the best advice she could have given me. Think.
Yes. Jackie and I were both very serious and long time 4-H members and in Burleigh County. And that certainly contributed to the shaping of our characters. I was always a very, very timid little girl. I would much rather hide behind mom's skirts. And of course, that was the era where women wore big skirts. And I was quite happy about that because I could just get lost in mom's skirt and I didn't have to talk to anybody. I could, and unless she pulled me out from the folds of that fabric and told me to say hello to someone. But I was a very, very shy girl. And it wasn't until I got into 4-H and started giving demonstrations or educational presentations. I did my first one at age 10, the first year I was in 4-H, and that seemed to really bring me out of my shell and give me confidence in what I was doing. And there were so many wonderful benefits about the 4-H program that really helped mature Jackie and me and help develop our characters. And to then go on to, especially to study home economics education at North Dakota State University.
That has elicited a couple of comments and questions. Richard says, sort of related to the story of your father teaching in a small school in South Dakota, the same guy was the mayor and the janitor, and he'd blow the whistle to start the game and clean up after.
Yep.
Yes.
Jack of all
Yeah.
trades.
And then a question from Mary. What games did you play at home and at school?
Okay. At home, we played lots of paper dolls.
Mhm.
We also had dolls, and we played this silly little have the scenario of Babs and Mabs. Now, these were two women who stayed home with their babies, and our husbands were policemen, and they went out to work. And so then we would take our little dolls in the buggies, and we would go down the hall, or maybe we go outside and we'd push our buggies around. In school, but anything else? Oh, I know.
How many of you remember the TV show Dragnet with Jack Webb? I mean,
Yes.
he was Joe the detective. Well, Joe was, I think, was your husband, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. I always got the good-looking guy.
Yes. I don't remember who
Joe and
I
Mike. Anyway, then we would also have. I had a wooden horse, stick wooden horse, and then when I was 9 or so, then I got a real pony, and we both eventually. And there's a story in there about the real pony and the other real pony and the big horse. That's quite an interesting story. At school, we played crokinole or Karen's, it's called. Anyone know that game? We played marbles outside. And then, of course, we had quite a few pieces of outdoor equipment, the swings and the slides and the merry-go-round, et cetera, et cetera. And then there was a softball game. In the winter, there was a terrific sledding hill that we used. We played pump up, pull away. What else, Janine?
Tag.
Yeah.
Tag.
Yeah.
The goals were the steps to the school and the flagpole. That was just the right distance for running from base to base.
And we made a pie and made in the snow and fox and goose, that game. Maybe some of you had the same experiences, the same games. How about the person who asked this question? Is that familiar? Were those games familiar?
Let's see. I can unmute her. Mary, I'm going to unmute you, or I have to ask you to unmute if you want to talk with Janine and Jackie with that great question.
Yes, we played some of the same games. Did you play Kick the Tin Can, which of course would happen when somebody would get hit by the can. In fact, one of my brothers got hit by the can in the middle of his forehead, so then moms decided we shouldn't play Kick the Tin Can anymore, that was too dangerous. But we played a lot of the same games. We also, our softball field was in the corner of where there were barbed wire fences. And so when you were catching, you were in the corner of where the barbed wire fences met. And so that was always a little tricky because as a girl in those years, you wore skirts and dresses to school. And I would, of course, have a dress on. And if you had to go through the barbed wire fence to get a ball that went back there, inevitably you'd tear your skirt or whatever. And I
Yeah.
can remember one time going home from school and I was so excited. I said to my mom, I didn't even tear my skirt today. So it was like, evidently it was more of an everyday occurrence, but that particular day I had evidently gone through the fence and was successful in not tearing my skirt. Because of course, those nice 3-corner tears, you know, so had to be
So
repaired.
Mary, did you wear cotton long stockings with your skirts?
Sometimes it depends upon, but we always wore, you know, jeans underneath the dresses when it was really cold. And then of
Yes.
course, when we get to school, we could take them off. But yes, but you had a dress on. You know,
Yes.
you didn't wear jeans to go to school.
No.
Corduroy pants was what we
Yes.
had.
Mhm.
And we did a lot of oohing and ahhing with Montgomery Ward's and Sears catalogs when they came. Oh my goodness. Mom sewed our clothes. And then when Jackie and I got in 4-H, we took over that responsibility and had lots of fun doing it, and then really enlarged our wardrobes by doing it. But it to look in those catalogs and just drool over the opportunity to have clothes like that. And Mom was a creative enough seamstress that we would show her what might be our favorite dress, and then she would make it for us. So we were pretty blessed that way. But I have to think, and I know how, you know, I was not a large child, but I was probably a little oversized for my age, but thankfully I never had to wear chubby sized dresses. Do you remember that? How embarrassing that would have been for a little girl to have to be put in a chubby sized dress. Oh my goodness. Thank heavens they don't make those anymore.
Yes. Yeah.
That's so funny. What great stories. Anyone else have a question to kind of finish us off? We just have a couple of minutes left.
Teaser, we've got Ron in the room.
Oh, great.
So,
What part did religion play in your family?
Oh, very much so. We went to a community. There were 2 churches in our community. One was a Catholic church and one was a community church that was supported by the Methodist Church. But it was pretty ecumenical, you know. It was Protestant, let's put it that way. And so we went to Sunday school every Sunday. Our neighbor, Mrs. Dance, picked us up.
Mrs.
Mom,
Salter.
excuse
Mrs.
me, Mrs.
Salter.
Salter. Mrs. Dance was the superintendent. And Mom would tie, I don't know, a dime or a quarter or something or other, depending, to a little hanky, and then we'd take it with us. And then it would go to those poor children in Africa or wherever it happened to be. I always trusted that, yes, my money would make a difference to go there. So then Mom and Dad came later on to church. One of our fond memories is of Mom and Dad singing a duet. And we're so proud of them. And I credit my mom, I sing alto, and I credit my mom for the gift she gave me, because I can very easily hear the alto of any musical part. And I think it's because when I grew up, I listened to her sing alto. And so that's my brain just switches to alto right away. When I Mom came from a German Lutheran background. And so when it was time for me and for Janine to go to confirmation, then we went to Trinity Lutheran Church in Bismarck. And then confirmation, and then that was our church. Mom and Dad were married there. Janine and I were married to our individual husbands there, and so that was kind of our home church. Grandpa and Grandma went there too. But I think as far as it's certainly, and it's been coming to me more as an adult, how important it is to have a faith, because there was some country western singer that had the song, if you got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything. And so having a Christian background is just to help throughout my life. Janine, what do you want to say? Anything?
Yes, the love that our neighbor, Grandma Salter, Mrs. Mabel Salter, shared with our family just by picking up Jackie and me to go to Sunday school. And she had her two little granddaughters in the car as well. And the four of us really were gifted a Christian education, beginning with her love that caused her desire for us to know the love of Jesus. And that was so instrumental for what my initial memories of a Christian education were. All relate to her. I think it was just expected in our home that we would be honest, that we would be loving to mankind and to animals, God's creatures, that we would steward the land that God gave us, and that we would give thanks for all the riches that he bestowed on us, even though they might have been meager. They were blessings. And we, as far praying, we would pray at nighttime before we went to bed. Mom and Dad were always there when we said our prayers. And it's of course mealtime prayers, but usually only during the holidays. So, but at school though, even in our country school, at noon we would say the prayer, "Come Lord Jesus, be our guests, and let these gifts just be blessed." Amen.
We'd also say, "No, noontime has come, the board is
That's
spread.
right.
Thanks be to him who gives us bread. Praise God for bread." We could sing here, but we won't.
Yes. So, when you talk about faith, it was very, very instrumental, sometimes in quiet times and sometimes more obvious.
Thank you for that. I got a question from Dawn about the Volga Germans, or Germans from Russia, who came to settle the West, and she wondered if you would speak to that a little bit, and that's probably all we'll have time to do.
Well, he came from the area and I might be pronouncing this wrong, Bessaraba. Is that familiar with you? Okay. So it's there, and this all happened because there was a period of time when things were not very safe in Germany. And about the same time, Catherine of Russia said, "I've got all this land here around the Volga Sea. It's free. Just come and settle it." Well, was it 200, 250 years that worked? And then the Bolshevik Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. So then many of Russians from that era came to the United States. I remember Grandma saying it was about 2000. I don't know when it was, but anyway, her parents left because of the Russian oppression.
And she immigrated with them. Is that correct? Or was she born here?
She was born in Parkston, South Dakota.
Okay.
Yeah, but her older sister Dorothea was born over there. Do you know Parkston, South Dakota?
Oh my God, that's 12 miles from my hometown in Tripp, South Dakota.
Okay.
We are definitely related. I need to get in touch with you. You said you had a website?
Yes.
For the book, it's
Right.
www.wildthewindmillwatched.com, the name of the
Got it.
book.
Thank you.
Yes, and we can be reached through that website via email. Our email is sisters@wildthewindmillwatched.com.
That's a great way to end, with the email address. And what a wonderful hour this has been. Thank you so much to Jackie and Janine for sharing your stories with us. And I'm sure you've prompted many memories and lots of questions too. And there's a new message. Funny that the chat will. Oh yes, and then Catherine wants to remind us that if you're not a member of the State Historical Society, we'd love for you to join us, and there is a link in the chat for that.